So Gearbox just released a major update for Risk of Rain 2, Phase 1 of their Seekers of the Storm 2.0 roadmap, focusing on items and elites. Probably the two most important things when it comes to how the DLC was received, other than the bugs, of course. And boy, do I have some feedback. So we're going to be talking all about the update today, including, but not limited to, an overview of what changed for the elites and the items, my role in this because I did get to test it, funny Antler shield lore, how I feel about these items because I am making this video after I streamed a whole bunch, twitch.tv/R&D Thursday, why I was right the whole time, XD Lamau, how I feel about Gearbox and Risk of Rain 2 currently, and what's next. For starters, a question that I've been asked a very long time, and my answer has usually been the same. Do you recommend buying Seekers of the Storm? And my response has always been, well, you know, that's personal preference. I mean, I bought it, but, And then boom, like a Jimmy Neutron brain blast, a realization would dawn upon me. Twisted elites existed, so no, you shouldn't buy Seekers of the Storm. But I'm happy to report, finally, the Wicked Witch is dead, and Twisted are no longer the buttholes that they were. Instead of the old functionality where they generated an aura, kind of like a Celestine Elite, but instead of invisibility, it was the most mind-boggling effect ever, which was doing any damage to any enemy inside that aura, whether it be a 10,000 damage ATG proc or a 1-tick bleed, you would take 2.5% of your max HP as damage. That made looping borderline impossible. It was so bad that I've had the Remove Twisted Elites mod on basically since the DLC came out. Now, the new functionality is that Twisted Elites now tethered to nearby enemies, and if you do damage to those enemies that are tethered, it charges up a crystal on their heads, which when fully charged up will chase you down like a child attack, do a buttload of damage, and apply Lunar Ruin, which is just the false sun effect which makes you take 10% more damage from everything. Gilded Elites were changed a lot as well. They got nerfed, so they're not as high damaging or high armor or high HP. They're more in line with the regular elite types that they're supposed to be around. They removed the really annoying ability for them to steal gold and have a billion armor if you shot them while their tiny little aura was up. And now instead, they shoot golden spikes at the ground. You'll be able to tell. Kind of like a mini Aurelia Knight attack. And if they hit you, they knock the sonic rings right out of your hand. You can pick your gold back up. They look like Gore's Tomes. But unlike Gore's Tome, they actually decay over time, so they're more like monster teeth in a way. Long story short, the elites are way better now, so you can buy the game, everybody. Alright, before we dive into the items, I just want to take a second to say that I'm very impressed that Gearbox is headed in the right direction here. The cat's kind of out of the bag already since several creators have already talked about it, but a whole bunch of us got to test out this beta and all of these items, not necessarily all in the state that they are now, but we were able to test and were heavily encouraged to give a lot of feedback. That plus the fact that we have 17 uncles as the community manager again, which I mean this is old news, old November news, is proof that Gearbox is at least putting in some effort, and I gotta give it up to him for that. High five. I feel like this bodes well for the future of Risk of Rain 2, and it shows that the community's voice does actually matter. What was my role in all of this? I'm just a mouth breather with fart sound effects. So even though I left some thoughtful feedback that I hoped would help, I was just one of many, earnestly scribbling down my thoughts, even though I'm sure it looked more like a monkey rubbing its feces against the wall. Thank you, Gearbox. That was the cheapest therapy I've ever had. In all seriousness, I did promise some Antler shield lore. So here it is. I wrote this around the time I was testing things. In other words, I already saw the elusive Antler rework and went as far to say that not only was this going to be one of the most well-received items in the entire rework list, I personally thought it was one of the best reworks. And like a month later, I made the Antler shield video. Listen, Antler bros, don't shoot me. I'm not a traitor, all right? Maybe a double agent a little bit, okay? But chaos is a ladder. And there's only been a few times where I've intentionally fucked with people in my videos. Okay, maybe more than a few, but it's funny every time. And I know a large portion of you are never gonna see this video in the first place. So no, the Antler propaganda will never stop. Satire or Sartre, you're never gonna know. Anyways, with all of that out of the way, let's actually talk about the new items. Not only did I test out a bunch of them, but I also played it earlier today on release, so I've got a feel for a couple of the items. Starting from the top, Antler Shield. Rest in peace, you beautiful bastard. Renamed to Elusive Antlers. Oh god. The original Antler Shield was just essentially a damage reflect with the worst numbers possible. A 50% chance to reflect 10% of the damage an enemy would do to you, and stacking it only gave you 5% increased chance and 10% increased damage. So you wouldn't even get to 100% proc chance until you had 10 Antler Shields. Meanwhile, the new Elusive Antlers increases movement speed by 7% plus 7% per stack, spawns orbs of energy nearby every 10 seconds minus 10% per stack, giving 12% movement speed up to 3 times, plus 1 per stack for 12 seconds. Ignoring that long description, here's essentially what this means. Number 1, you have basically a mocha and flat movement speed increase each stack, half a goat hoof, with orbs that spawn around you, usually only in your field of vision, and relatively close to you, that each give 12% movement speed for 12 seconds. In other words, Elusive Antlers, a white common item, with 1 stack of this item, can give you 43% movement speed with 100% uptime even with a single stack. And stacking it further essentially gives you 19% bonus movement speed per stack because you get the flat movement speed bonus and then you get an extra 12% movement speed bonus stack. So without a doubt, it is hands down the best movement speed item in the game. It's no surprise that people are going to love this item, but more on that later. Let's continue. Bolstering Lantern. The old functionality of below 50% HP, you get more damage, meaning that this item was almost never active and was kind of buns. The new functionality increases your attack speed by 10% for up to 4 plus 2 per stack enemies and allies within 20 meters. It's a focus crystal, but for attack speed. And yes, it also said allies, so NG turrets, yeah. Long story short, you can get up to 40% attack speed from just the first stack, and the item's really good. Growth Nectar. Now, the old one required you to have 5 plus unique buffs to gain 20% bonus stats for 5 seconds, and the new Growth Nectar is 7% bonus stats for every buff you have, up to a maximum of 4 plus 4 per stack. To put it into perspective, the new Growth Nectar gives you more stats than the previous 5 plus buffs would give you, all while still functioning even if you only have 1 buff. I played several runs with Growth Nectar, and let me tell you, it's all you really need. I had a Benthic Bloom run where my only movement speed was coming from Growth Nectar, and I bought a Stoneflex Pauldron because I was tired of moving so fast. Next up is Warped Echo. What the old Warped Echo would do is every time you would take damage, 50% of that damage would be dealt immediately, and 50% would be dealt 3 seconds later, which a whole bunch of caveats that didn't take away one-shot protection, also worked with medkit, but also didn't work with planula, repulsion armor, etc., etc. Don't worry about that. The new functionality is the next source of damage is reduced by 30% and spread into 3 plus 1 per stack hits. All echo damage is non-lethal except for the final hit. Recharges every 15 seconds, minus 3% per stack. Not sure about this change in general, even though I played a little bit with it. I can't really tell if it's helping or hurting. An old Warped Echo had synergy with things like medkit, but because the new Warped Echo's ticks are so fast, medkit doesn't work with them. And again, just like the old Warped Echo, Tougher Times doesn't work with it. Planula, repulsion armor, extra armor when you're taking the bonus damage, etc. The most interesting part to me is that the next source of damage is reduced by 30%, which makes me wonder whether or not this works with Opal, and if it does, how exactly does it work with Opal, and how does it work with armor? If I have 50% damage reduction from armor, and I have a Warped Echo, does that mean I'm going to have 80% damage reduction? I don't know, I'll have to test. This is the most iffy item out of all of them for me. Alright, I couldn't resist. I did some testing on the Warped Echo, so this is post-edit R&D, and I know we're not supposed to do R&D on any day other than Thursday, but here we are. First off, medkit does work on Warped Echo, but it doesn't work on the individual ticks. Also, the background footage you're seeing, yeah, the Warped Echo shield bug still exists in a different form, slightly less powerful, and has insane anti-synergy with Opal. But that's for a video in the future, so you better subscribe if you want to be in the know. Next, we have War Bonds, which is probably even more memed on than Antler Shield at this point. The old functionality was you basically get gold at the start of every stage, and the new functionality is kind of like classified access codes from Risk of Rain / Risk of Rain Returns, where at the beginning of boss events, so this means Aurelionite Mithrix, Alloyed Worship Unit, a whole bunch of missiles bombard the boss, dealing a percentage of their max HP, 2.5% to be exact, per missile. I got this a few times in my runs when I was playing, and I wasn't really able to test out how good the item was, because by the time I got it, the run was already so far gone, I'd insta-kill the bosses anyway. But this is obviously a very strong red item now, and it makes a funny little sound every time it gets used. Runic Lens. Now, Runic Lens didn't even really get changed that much. In fact, I don't even know if it got changed at all. The description was just changed, and the VFX for it, so the meteor landing, was updated so you can actually tell where and when this was landing. The item was ridiculously strong already, but no one could tell what it was doing because the effects were kind of, unnoticeable. Knockback Fin, now renamed to Breaching Fin. God, I love a good comeback story. I think most people know the old Knockback Fin gave you a chance on hit to knock enemies up in the air, but not very often, not very far, and it also didn't stun them or do anything useful. The only way I could think about using this item was finding a cliff and knocking enemies off that, or by stacking over 200 and instantly killing enemies because you knocked them out of the skybox. Now, instead of doing that goofy shit, grounded enemies hit with any skill are launched and stunned. Enemies hit while airborne are launched up again up to 2 times, plus 1 per stack. Launched enemies take increased damage by 20% from all sources per launch, and recharges after 10 seconds, increased to uncommon green rarity. The cool thing about the Breaching Fin is not only is it just bonus damage for any enemy you hit, but it also works on like 90% of the enemies. Teleporter bosses, Mithrix, they all get launched in the air and stunned. But for some reason, Knockback Fin was so bad that not only were there like 5 enemies out of hundreds that you could actually use it on, but if one of those 5 enemies was a teleporter boss, which means it has a little HP HP bar at the top. So let's say, for example, you got Mending Beetle, Horde of Many as your teleporter event. Knockback Fin wouldn't work on them. Why? Low-key, after figuring this part out when I was playing with it, it made me wonder if we were just being fucked with in the first DLC patch. Because you'll have items like Knockback Fin which get changed from being really bad to a totally different item with a bunch of effects like 100% plus damage, 200% movement speed, jerks you off the completion, and at the end they'll throw in something that should have just been on the original item in the first place, like stunning the enemies. All I'm saying is, we live in a society. Noxious Thorn. The old one was essentially you get hit and there was a 1 in 4 chance that you either inflicted bleed or increased the amount of debuffs on a random enemy nearby. It was a pretty bad item for a lot of reasons, but for the most part, it didn't work until like a couple weeks ago. The new Noxious Thorn gained 10% chance to bleed an enemy. On killing an enemy, transfer 33% of every debuff stack to one enemy, plus 1 per stack within 20 meters, plus 5 meters per stack. So for one, just the fact that it adds 10% bleed is already a major buff, but the fact that you can now transfer 33% of every debuff, which by the way, if you have a debuff that only has 1 stack, that will still transfer the 1 stack to an enemy since it rounds up, means that Noxious Thorn is one of the stronger greens now. Bleed, Gasoline, Lunar Ruin, and even Deathmark are all transferable. Poison and Blight are both also transferable, so Acrid is terrific with this item. I know because when I played Acrid earlier today, I got 2 of them on the first stage, and it was a massacre. Another favorite among the community so far, and one of my favorites because it's so unique. You know? Unstable Transmitter. Now this item was so bad that I honestly would never pick it up. And when I would pick it up, it was only because I knew there was a scrapper on the map. Long story short, it would teleport you at 25% HP, which would either cause you to die if you were on Eclipse, because it would sometimes just yeet you into the ground, or teleport your corpse because you were already dead. Now, the new Unstable Transmitter, falling below 25% HP, gives you 75% of your maximum HP as a temporary barrier. Gain a dimensional aura for 8 seconds that bleeds and teleports away its enemies. Enemies killed by the aura extend the duration by 1 second, and recharges every 45 seconds, minus 10% per stack. So immediately, the old Unstable Transmitter had a cooldown of 2 minutes. The new one has a cooldown of 45 seconds. That's already a massive improvement. And the fact that it gives you a barrier now, so it's an actual defensive item instead of just teleporting you away somewhere random where you could die anyway. And it gives you a little frost relic thing that teleports enemies away and causes them to take bleed damage, is actually pretty cool. And I've tried this item out a couple times. It saved my life already, and I've only played with it for a single day. People have already mentioned that this functions almost like a red because it's essentially a recharging elixir, a 45-second cooldown elixir. Big fan and very strong. Luminous Shot. Now the old Luminous Shot would charge up every time you use your secondary attack. And once you use your primary attack, there would be a little lightning bolt that would do 150% base damage. The newer version is somewhat the same, but with a whole bunch of added stats to it. Now it requires 3 charges before it even fires once. Each of the lightning strikes do 175% total damage, not base damage, which is a massive improvement. They can actually proc now, they couldn't before. And on top of all of that, it reduces your secondary cooldown by 20%. Starstorm 2 sends the regards. Very strong item, but they did nerf the Railgunner zoom in, zoom out thing, so save yourself the grief, it doesn't work anymore. Chronic Expansion. Now I have a Chronic Expansion video you could check out that talks all about the old Chronic Expansion and even highlights one of the bugs I found, which I think has been patched. Long story short, the old Chronic Expansion would require you to kill 5 enemies to get the single buff, and as long as you were continuously doing damage to enemies, you could keep doing this over and over infinitely. There was no cap, which would cause, forgive me please, Chronic Expansion builds to get out of control and you'd one-shot Mithrix. With the new version, just like how Growth Nectar changed, instead of having to kill 5 enemies to get the buff, you now only have to kill 1, and it gives you a smaller buff, 3.5% versus the 10% of old Chronic Expansion. And instead of infinite Chronic Expansion stacks, as the old one did, you can only get 10 stacks on your first stack and plus 5 for every stack after that. Dealing damage still refreshes the timer. There's a couple things about this I just want to note real quick. Number 1, there's a lot of quality of life added here. There's going to be a little beep beep every time you're about to lose your Chronic Expansion stacks. We'll talk about a lot of the other quality of life stuff towards the end of the video. And 2, even though this is technically a nerf to Chronic Expansion since you can't get infinite damage, I think this is a healthier change for the item overall and feels a lot better to use. Some final minor changes. The Chance Doll, still the same exact item, but now the VFX and other things are changed. If you succeed with a Chance Doll, it's going to have a green text popping up saying you were rewarded. The shrine will also puff out little green VFX, so it's pretty obvious when the item actually works. Gives you a lot of good feedback. They also say that Sonor's Whispers was nerfed from 15% to 4%, but it's been that way for a long time. I don't know if they just added this to the patch notes now or what, but that's how it's been. As for prayer beads, the functionality is unchanged, but it adds text when you're removing them, telling you exactly what you're gaining, and has officially been blacklisted from printers. No more free wins, I'm sorry guys. When they say the functionality is unchanged, I don't know if that means that scrapping your prayer beads is still bad. Haven't tested it out long enough, but maybe someone in the comments will know. Long-standing Solitude, free unlock buff is now retained between stages. Gold cost for interactables in multiplayer now increased by 50%, down from being increased by 100%. As I have 0 friends, I don't know if if this is that big of a deal. Everyone's always told me that Longstanding Solitude is busted in multiplayer, but the free unlock buff is really good. Longstanding Solitude was already a good item, and the fact that it just got buffed is even crazier to me. Seed of Life now works when given to an equipment drone. An Electric Boomerang no longer applies bleed when carrying Sommering equipment, which is a rest in peace to that tech. Guess that's the last time Sommerang's ever getting used, huh? So that's basically it for all the reworks, although I wouldn't leave just yet because I'm about to dive into more of the intricacies of these. To put into perspective on how these items have changed, here is my tier list from the beginning of the Seekers of the Storm. You might notice there's a lot of bad items, and you might notice that most of those items are borderline broken now. The lowest I'd put any of these items is in B, and I'd probably only put them there just because it would feel so weird putting so many items into the A and S tier. It's like when you're taking an exam and all the answers seem to be B. Even if you think those are the right answers, you start filling in A and C randomly because there's no shot that the entire test is all B. That's how it feels looking at this tier list now, which leads me to my point of I was always right. Hubris be damned. The whole reason that the Antler Shield meme came about was because when I reacted to the first roadmap, in which they were very vague about what exactly they were changing, but based off of the words they were using for a lot of things, I was just assuming they were just going to buff everything. This is kind of a problem. It looks like what they're going to be doing is just making everything better. Like everything's just going to be better. So we're power creeping everything. Which, I mean, I can't really blame them. It's not really, I mean, it is kind of Gearbox fault. All right. You're the adults here. All right. You got to tell the children that no, they can't have candy for dinner. All right. You get vegetables. The vegetables being Antler Shield. Because the Antler Shield change was the only one that they were showing us, and it randomly went from an item where you reflect damage to enemies to a movement speed item, which at the time, a lot of people were complaining about the diluted item pool and having trouble with movement speed, meant that the only weapon that I could wield against what I thought was going to be power creep was the Antler Shield. And as history has proven, it's not the greatest weapon. After playing the new patch today, I am still genuinely worried about power creep. I played 3 runs today, and every single one was a god run. And not even a god run from like looping 50 times. I legitimately could have walked into Mithrix each run as soon as I could, and felt comfortable beating him every time. In fact, the one run I did die was because I was playing Acrid, Ravenous Bite by the way. Check out the loadout video. With Benthic Bloom and looped a couple times because I blame Warbonds for not showing up for 10 plus stages. So when phase 4 Mithrix came around and he stole all my items, not only could I not get into melee range because I had 1,000 Tesla coils, or should I say he had them, I also couldn't apply my poison because he had 19 Ben's raincoats, and that was the run I lost. My items were so good I couldn't even beat them. All of this to say, I'm pretty sure that the game is just power creep to hell right now. Nearly every single item in the DLC is best in class at whatever it does. Oh, and bonus meme by the way, Unstable Transmitter will proc before you lose your elixirs or watches, which is great because it's a terrific defensive item, and honestly that was my main complaint with it in the first place. But did you know that not only does it have a 45-second cooldown, but Blast Shower refreshes the cooldown on Unstable Transmitter? Just thought I'd share that little tidbit for you. I'd say, more than likely, people are going to have a lot of fun with the DLC for now, but the game's going to become ridiculously easy, and I don't even know if I'm going to be able to play Starstorm 2 with this DLC enabled anymore. This shit's starting to feel pay to win. But give it a month or two, maybe less, and people are going to complain about how easy the game is. Candy for dinner and tummy aches, etc., etc. Now, with all that being said, I think that Gearbox is actually doing a tremendous job so far, and the fact that they are openly soliciting feedback from not only just content creators, but just about anybody, shows that they're putting in an actual effort. And keep in mind that this is just feedback. People can disagree with me about power creep, or if the game's too easy, or etc, etc. Doesn't matter to me, but shit doesn't change unless you speak up, and it seems like Gearbox is actually listening, so here we are. While this is technically criticism of the balance changes, I do feel for the Gearbox developers who are doing their best, and although some of you might not remember it, back when Risk of Rain 2 was in early access and it was just releasing on Steam, finding a sticky bomb printer was essentially an instant win because it just gave you more damage per stack. 125% damage. So it even took time for Hopu to actually figure out how to balance the items. And here's the good news. Gearbox actually did a really good job reworking items and keeping the original concept in the back of their minds. For most items anyway. You can see this in things like War Bonds, where the gold mechanic is still tied into how it works. Noxious Thorn still has the AoE increasing debuffs on enemy effect, and even Unstable Transmitter, which most people would have agreed was an unsalvageable item, but they still managed to keep the core concept of it alive. It's just now a little broken. The great news about this is that most of these ideas are all very good now, and instead of having to rework all the items, now they could just adjust the numbers to make it better or worse. Now, probably for the most important section, which kind of ties into the power creep section as well. One of the greatest things about this new update is all of the quality of life that they're adding. Elusive Antlers might be a very good and broken movement speed item, but it is also a well-designed item, both visually and otherwise. For every one comment I see where Elusive Antlers is brought up as being a strong movement speed item, I see at least 5 others say that they just like the blue orbs that spawn and the sound it makes. And the runic lens, I don't even know if they really changed the damage numbers on it. I'm like 99% sure they didn't, but the fact they added the VFX to it that made it more clear when it was landing, just that effect alone makes it seem like runic lens is doing triple the amount of damage it did before. Breaching fin, the upgraded version of knockback fin, is yet another item that, while strong, I've heard more people talk about the sound it makes than the actual effects of the item itself. War Bonds, Chance Doll, and Chronic Expansion, oh, and Prayer Beads, all got quality of life additions as well, which has not only improved the items themselves from an enjoyment perspective, but also makes it clear to players when something is happening on their screen. When the False Sun first came out, I think it was a bug and not actually by design, but his charge attack, the Club of the Forsaken, where you hold your little club over your head and smash it down, that attack didn't have any vibration or like oomph to it for the first couple days, and I thought it did no damage because of that. And I could see the raw numbers itself. It's one of the strongest primaries in the game, doing 1500% damage with a 3.0 proc coefficient. And even knowing the numbers, I was unconsciously using the ability less because it just felt limp. And after they added that oomph to it, I think it was like a sound effect or something, it immediately felt better and I started using it more. It felt good to use, and my dopamine-fueled little brain liked it. Here's the gist of my point. I think for most of the new items, the reworked ones, you could cut the numbers in half and people would have still enjoyed them. Chronic Expansion is a perfect example. It was quite literally infinite damage as long as you just kept shooting things, and there was a not so insignificant portion of people that thought it was a C tier item. And for some reason, I'm pretty sure that most of those people are going to rank it higher even though it's worse now. Partially because it's easier to use, partially because it's more clear when it's working, and partially because of the beep. I'm sure if Antler Shield made a funny noise when people used it, that shit would still be around right now. Okay, so what's next? Next up on the docket for them is Phase 2, and that's going to be the False Sun Prime Meridian boss fight changes. Just about everything about the False Sun and that entire area is going to get a change. And I don't mean the character, by the way, I mean explicitly the boss fight. And John said we wouldn't get any news until early January of next year, so enjoy the holidays, everybody. Phase 3 is the survivor buffs and whatnot. That's the Plan Chef rework. And not to be cliche, but let's see what they can cook up. Anyway, I rambled on long enough. There's going to be plenty more videos coming out now. And as promised in the last tier list video, I get to farm you again for another one. Looking forward to your comments, and looking forward to everyone but me being wrong again. High five, SwagBuddy69, signing out.